Assalamu alaikum. My name is Mohammad Mas Khan, and the topic I chose for my presentation is the Ricardian equivalence. I'll actually begin the video by introducing fiscal policy and then move on to Ricardian equivalence because it's very important to understand how fiscal policy works before moving on to Ricardian equivalence. So I'll talk about what the Ricardian equivalence is, how it works, how feasible it is in reality, and the assumptions it undertakes, and the idea of and what the idea of Ricardian equivalence would actually mean for economics. So, first thing is the fiscal policy. So, the fiscal policy uses the means of taxation and government spending to influence the aggregate demand in the economy, which in turn has an effect on inflation and economic growth. An expansionary fiscal policy would involve tax cuts and increase government spendings to prompt an increase in consumption and economic growth. With lower taxes, people would be left with a higher disposable income, and this would actually increase their purchasings. So the aggregate demand or GDP of the economy would grow. Increased government spendings would lead to better infrastructure and development of the public sector, which in turn would create new jobs and income for the people. So, in theory, all of this should increase the GDP and help the economy grow. This would also actually reduce unemployment but cause inflation on the other hand. So, the government actually has to choose between the two. So I'm going to draw first a diagram of how an expansionary fiscal policy works and then talk about the contractionary fiscal policy. So we have the output here and we have the price here and the long run aggregate supply. This is the aggregate demand in the economy. Okay. So an expansionary fiscal policy should look like this, and how it works is actually increases the C part of the equation, which is sorry, y equals C plus I plus G plus X minus M. So in theory, all of this should, an expansionary fiscal policy should increase the C component of the GDP, and this would in turn increase the the aggregate demand and move it from AD1 to AD2, and this is because of the increase in C. So this would actually increase the prices in the general price level in the economy, causing inflation. And but it, on the other hand, it would increase the output of the economy and potentially reduce unemployment in the economy. Um, so this is how the expansionary fiscal policy works, and the contractionary fiscal policy is actually the exact opposite of all of this. It raises taxes and reduces government spendings. And by the same logic, the demand should go down, limiting spending and thus the inflation in the economy. Contractionary fiscal policy. Okay. So moving on, all of this in theory should work, but many economists actually argue that fiscal policy is not practical. And one of the first economists to suggest this was David Ricardo in the early 19th century, and he introduced the theory of Ricardian, or actually it was later coined as the Ricardian equivalence. Many other economists also worked on this theory and established this. One of the notable economists who expanded and worked on this theory was Robert Barrow, who was a professor of economics in Harvard University. So, Ricardian equivalence actually reflects on how the consumers react to a fiscal policy by the state. It argues that consumers are less likely to be aware of these fiscal changes in the economy and, as such, do not give a very immediate reaction to it. It goes against the common belief that when governments cut taxes or spend more money, consumers respond to this by increasing spending. But this theory argues that in reality, consumers are less likely to react to changes in their disposable income because they know that uh, cut in the taxes uh, would lead to a rise in the taxes in the future. The Ricardian view is that consumers are not short sighted and all of them are rational enough to understand that a tax cut leading to a change in their disposable income or rise in government spendings should not change their level of consumptions. This is because consumers actually plan ahead in the future and know that a tax cut in the present would actually be set off by an increase in the taxation in the future because the current tax cut is financed by government debts and the government has to pay for it somehow. And they expect that the taxes would rise in the future to help pay for the tax cut. Okay, so they actually do not respond to fiscal policy as originally believed by many. Tax cuts, which are funded by government debts, are to be rationally expected to be followed by a rise in taxes to improve the budget of the government. So consumers are actually not left better off by a fiscal policy, and they do not spend more than they currently do in anticipation of the future. So the amount of tax cut originally planned increases private savings for the future and decreases the public savings by the same amount, which practically means that the national savings of a country remain unchanged regardless of what fiscal policy it adopts. So people know that taxes are to be followed by a rise in future, so they do not change their spending, which would actually make fiscal policy um, less effective, if not useless. So, as an example, if I am a fully rational consumer and I experience an increase in my disposable income because of our tax cut policy by the current government, which is funded by debt, I should understand that this cut would be this cut would be followed by an increase in the future. So I should start saving up for the future instead of just going off and increasing my spendings on goods and services that I actually don't need. Um, so I'm gonna draw an ISLM curve for Ricardian. So this is the Ricardian model. And this is the output. This is the LM curve. And this is the IS curve. So, an expansionary fiscal policy in the Ricardian world would virtually leave out no effects on the output of the economy because the ice curve does not shift because consumers are rational and they know that the tax cut would be followed by a tax increase in the future. So they should not increase their spendings and they start saving up for the future instead. But in the non-Ricardian model, we have uh, consumption rising because of tax cuts and increase in government spendings. So the IS curve shifts out and we have an increase in the output of the economy. This theory, which is mostly followed by classical economists, against the Keynesian idea of fiscal policy manipulation of the economy, creates a time lag in fiscal policies, which would mean that expansionary or contractionary fiscal policies are not as effective as originally thought. But there are some assumptions that this theory takes. For the first assumption would be that people are always forward-looking and rational, which would not be the case in the real world. Also, it assumes that they can borrow and save at the same rate, so the value of money would not change for them, and they would be willing to sacrifice future spending for the current. It also assumes that people care about the financial well-being of their future generations or their future selves enough to be rational uh, for the future. Um, sorry. It also assumes that governments have an intertemporal budget constraint, which basically means that a tax cut in the budget is always financed by debt, and the government retaliates in the future by increasing taxes. But there are some limitations of the Ricardian model, uh, including the fact that not all consumers behave in this manner. Many people actually do not plan their fiscal years and spend more on their goods and services because human beings are naturally inclined to act irrationally. Also, borrowing constraints exist because of interest rates, and some cannot borrow enough to achieve their spending, so they end up using their tax cuts instead of saving. Another limitation is that people may just leave the planning, or sorry, the burden of future taxes to the future instead of just saving uh, right now. Also, they may not care enough about the future generations or even their future selves to plan this far ahead and worry about that. They may choose to adjust future spendings or optimize their future consumption rather than decrease their current consumption. Also, governments might just find a new way to finance the debts instead of future. So, Ricardian equivalence would also not hold in that case. Um, but the fact is that Ricardian equivalence is supported by the consumption smoothing theory, which states that people try to have a stable spending pattern throughout their lives rather than facing ups and downs in their spending and revenue streams. but it also defies the twin deficit theory, which states a strong correlation between the current account deficit and government budget. This link would actually not exist in case of if the Ricardian theory was 100% accurate. Um, so, to conclude, Ricardian theory would hold true for most people, but it would be unfair to generalize it for all individuals. And if the Ricardian theory does exist for everyone, this would mean that fiscal policies are useless, completely useless. But that's not the case, as there is sufficient evidence in real life data to suggest that the Ricardian theory is not always applicable on everyone. And but of course, there are instances, there are people who plan ahead and do this. Thank you.